Abaddon. The Fed's Four Horsemen unite. Pestilence, war, famine, death. One could give these four horsemen any cute nicknames that they desire. But what the four Fed heads all have in common is that they are destroyers, just like all the West's other central bankers. By Jeff Nielson. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations will grow up around them, will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. I believe the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken away from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Thomas Jefferson, 1802. A private central bank does not control the issue of U.S. currency. The Federal Reserve is the case with most of the nations in the world. These bankers do conspire to first inflate, then deflate what is the regular this is what the regular readers know as our bubble and crash cycles, which now seem to occur in more or less fixed 8-year intervals. The people are relentlessly being deprived of all property. The middle class is nearly extinct, having devolved into the working poor. Our children are literally waking up homeless, with millions of homeless people now struggling to survive across North America. Should we regard Thomas Jefferson as a prophet or simply as a sober individual engaging in logical extrapolation? History strongly suggests that the latter interpretation by a warning of entirely different nature. Give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes its laws. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, 1744 to 1812. That's what the Rothschild patriarch boasted, but that's not what he really meant. Give me control of the nation's money and I make its laws. Control the purse strings of any government and you control the government. Mayor Rothschild was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson was a scholar. He knew that this oligarch meant with his boast. He then took that boast and expanded it into the true horror that it represented. Central banks exist to steal. Indeed, they have literally licensed to steal via the power of the printing press. In this area, too, we have a famous source to offer us guidance. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. Alan Greenspan, 1966. Central banks create inflation. This is virtually their sole function. The central bankers constantly whine that inflation is too low, i.e., they aren't confiscating our savings, stealing our wealth as fast as they would like. But first, they instruct our subservient governments to lie about the rate of inflation so that people are unaware of the rate at which their wealth is being stolen. Central bankers steal out of the pockets of the people and funnel that stolen wealth into the vaults of the oligarchs who control these presses. Oligarchs like the Rothschilds. In the approximate 100 years since the Federal Reserve was entrusted with managing and protecting the U.S. dollar, it has lost roughly 99% of its value through the Fed's manufactured inflation. This still needs to be translated for benefit of some readers. In the century in which the Federal Reserve has controlled the U.S. printing press, 99% of all the wealth stored in the U.S. dollar has been stolen from the people and handed to the oligarchs, a financial crime syndicate which readers know as the One Bank. Adding literal injury to insult, the oligarchs commanded our puppet governments to borrow out our own currencies from these corrupt central banks. Thus, while all the wealth of the people was being stolen via the paper fraud of central banks, our government, and thus the people as well, have simultaneously been enslaved with debt. With one hand, the central banks and central bankers steal our wealth. With their other hand, they attach shackles of debt around our throats, all on behalf of their masters. These central bankers are guilty of the worst economic crimes against humanity, except for the deeds of the banking oligarchs themselves. Recently, the four worst criminals were all trotted out on a single stage: Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen. Greenspan and Bernanke's crimes are obvious. They are the great inflators. Undoubtedly, there will be many readers confused as to why Paul Volcker is listed as one of the four worst criminals. Incredibly, Paul Volcker's crimes include against humanity remain buried beneath ultra-thick layers of propaganda. It is Paul Volcker who now claims personal credit for the assassination of the gold standard. With that dirty deed, the crimes of the great inflators would have never been possible. We now, because of another of history's great inflators and charlatans, John Maynard Keynes, lamented that a gold standard is the golden handcuffs that prevent central bankers from such crimes of inflation. Paul Volcker, the modern father of inflation, even more incredibly, the central banker who gave birth to inflation, is actually lionized by the media for his second crime against humanity, enslaving the Western world in debt. It is Paul Volcker who, at the orders of his true masters, brought us 20% interest rates. Here, readers need to fully comprehend the level of perversity in our revisionist history. Volcker is the father of inflation, yet in our pseudo-history books, he's labeled as the knight that slayed inflation. Permanently, he is incorrectly credited as having slain the dragon which he gave birth. Even more absurd, the idea that inflation could be vanquished for any extended period of time via Volcker's usurious interest rates is just more revisionist nonsense. Inflation is an inherent, inevitable trait of every fiat currency printing press. It breeds inflation. The act of printing unbacked paper currency is the literal act of inflation, inflating the money supply. It was never possible that Volcker's usurious interest rates could vanquish inflation, but it did create something else: debt slavery. That crime against humanity has nearly run its course, and most Western regimes are teetering on outright bankruptcy. Understanding this second crime against humanity requires nothing more than the capacity to operate a calculator and understanding the concept of compound interest. To enslave the Western world in debt, it wasn't necessary to impose Volcker's usurious interest rates permanently or even for a long period of time. It only needed to be imposed once for a significant interval, and then the magic of compound interest did the rest. How did Ronald Reagan manage to triple the U.S. national debt in mere 8 years? He had help: Paul Volcker. How did Brian Mulroney manage to triple Canada's national debt in a mere 8 years at roughly the same time? He had help: Paul Volcker. As Keynes also points out, the golden handcuffs also make the crime against humanity of debt slavery impossible, since a golden standard is a balance of payments system. Volcker's first love child was inflation, his second was debt slavery. Arguably, Volcker is the worst of these criminals. Many readers will simply wonder at Janet Yellen being included as one of the horsemen. Volcker's crimes have been described, Greenspan and Bernanke, as the great inflators and also the great thieves, as explained by Greenspan himself. Volcker, Greenspan, and Bernanke were the assassins who destroyed and looted the U.S. economy and most of the Western world along with it. Yellen is merely a pallbearer of the corpse, but Yellen's crime is as the ultimate silent partner. Volcker, Greenspan, and Bernanke navigated the U.S. Titanic to the point where its massive iceberg now looms directly ahead. But Yellen is the skipper commanding the U.S. economy to stay the course. It's too late to avoid the iceberg created by Volcker, Greenspan, and Bernanke. But if Yellen was warning of the danger directly ahead, instead of hiding it, there would be far more survivors once the Titanic sinks. This brings us to the event itself. Why collect the Western world's four worst economic criminals and four most heinous liars and then put them on a single stage? Why else to lie about the present? One point they all agreed on: the U.S. isn't in a bubble economy, despite dire warnings from presidential candidates and some pundits. Put aside the fact that the mainstream propaganda machine is demonstrating the literacy skills of a 12-year-old and focus instead on the absurdity of this message. Anyone who simply looks at a long-term chart of the S&P 500 or a long-term chart of the U.S. Treasuries market will see that both of these markets have already passed into extreme bubble territory. The S&P 500 hasn't merely equaled the insanity of the dot-com bubble and the crash of the '08 bubble, it has soared well above those previous bubbles. The U.S. Treasuries market represents a bubble market which has been soaring higher uninterrupted for 35 years. These bubbles are merely more obvious, they are absolutely undeniable. Even more perversely, Alan Greenspan was the architect of the dot-com bubble while pretending it didn't exist at the time. Bernanke is the architect of both the 2008 equities bubble and the current equities bubble while pretending that neither of those bubbles existed. These are the two liars who literally have less credibility than anyone else on the planet when it comes to identifying bubbles. But why not trot them all out on stage? With the docile propaganda machine which never utters a contrary word when a Fed head speaks, there was never a possibility that the Four Horsemen would be called to account for their crimes, nor to have their bald-faced lies contradicted by the facts. Together, the tenures of the four participants cover more than one-third of the Fed's 102-year history. In a sane, legitimate society, that would have been the first line of indictment of the Four Horsemen for their collective crimes against humanity. Instead, the corporate media intended it as praise. More perverse still was the headline which accompanied that propaganda: Four Fed leaders under the microscope. Yes, a microscope with no lens. Pestilence, war, famine, and death. One can give these four horsemen any cute nicknames that they desire, but what the four heads of all have in common is that they are destroyers, just like all of the West's other central bankers. By Jeff Nielson. Take care. Keep stacking.